Here you have a war hero. There's a problem. He happens to be gay in a society in which it's illegal to be gay. Now, let us recall that in England at this time, we didn't yet have the benefit of computers as a metaphor to misunderstand ourselves. So we were stuck with the steam engine to misunderstand ourselves. And this was the Freudian set of misunderstandings. So the notion was that, well, if somebody's gay, it must mean that a certain sort of pressure is building up within them. Well, we don't really have any way to let the pressure out. There isn't any sort of little output, valve. So maybe if we put in the opposite kind of pressure, it'll balance him out. And this astonishingly ridiculous chain of thought led to the idea that Turing should be forced to endure massive doses of female hormones. He developed breasts, he developed other female characteristics, and became terribly depressed, and did something astonishing. He created a ritual in which he turned into a sort of an anti-Eve in order to kill himself. He laced an apple with cyanide in his lab and ate it, and collapsed in front of his machines. Now, just before Turing's death, he wrote something down which has the most unusual quality in that it contains a genuinely new spiritual idea. And this happens very, very rarely indeed. Turing wrote down a notion that we know of as the Turing test. It was a thought experiment. During these days post-war, thought experiments were high prestige activities because Einstein had used them to work out his ideas, and that made these big bombs. So everybody was into thought experiments. So in Turing's thought experiment, you start with a man and a woman, and they each, what we would call it today is they each tweet at you. You receive their tweets, and he asks, could you tell the man from the woman? Maybe either of them is trying to deceive you or something. Can't imagine why he would have been interested in that. Then he says, let's get rid of the woman, and we're going to replace her with a machine. Now there's going to be a computer tweeting at you and a man tweeting at you. Can you tell them apart? And then he says this remarkable thing, which is, if you can't tell them apart, and you're unwilling to grant human status or rights to the computer, aren't you guilty of some sort of, fascism? Aren't you guilty of doing something similar to what the Nazis were doing, the people that we just worked so hard to defeat? Well, he didn't say it quite that way. Now, I have to say that we know very little about what Turing thought about his test because he died so shortly after his first expression of it. We do have a few hints based on footnotes he left behind in technical papers and odd little scratches here and there. So it's very, very hard to really discern his intent and his thinking. And he was obviously, being tortured at the time, so it's just very hard to... And so I want to say that anything I say about Turing, you should keep in mind that no one really knows what was going through his head. It's impossible to know. At any rate, with that caveat, it seems plain to me that what Turing did is he actually invented a new form of death denial, which is the fundamental component of building a new religion. Not necessarily a new form of spirituality, but certainly a new religion. And what Turing did is he identified with this pristine form of life, which would be the life inside the digital device. If a computer could be like a person, then a person could be like a computer. And computers are free from the vagaries of sexuality. They can't be tortured with sex hormones. Computers don't have gender. They don't get sick. They don't die. Now, I have to say that at the time Turing wrote this, nobody had written a large program yet. Had he experienced what happens when programs get big, I think he would not have thought of them as these pristine things. But in the context in which he knew them, this made sense. Because little programs do have that quality. That's the difference between real and ideal computers, which is important to keep in mind. But at any rate, Turing invented this notion of identifying with the computer. Now, there's a range of cognitive states that are fairly common in people, but especially in males, which we think of as the spectrum of Asperger's syndrome, like cognition, sort of a touch of autism. Very, very common. And that is a way of being in which a person has a bit of trouble in empathizing and getting where other people are coming from. And since so many men have that, and they tend to be technically inclined, and Turing came up with this, Turing himself I don't think was like that, but he came up with this remarkable idea. The two things combined together, and thus the nerd or the geek was born. This is the origin of the nerdy, geeky feeling in computerdom. Now, the original idea was just a tiny seed, but it's evolved into an elaborate theology. For instance, any religion worth losing your life savings for has some vision of the end of days, some portentous events that only the initiated can understand, some coming Messiah or conflagration of some kind. In American evangelical thinking, there's the rapture. In this world of digital religion, there's a thing called the singularity, which is supposed to be a moment that'll happen maybe in the 2020s sometime, when all the computers get so good they start redesigning their own successors, and the process of computer improvement speeds up, and suddenly they take over the world in the blink of an eye, and then the big computer at the core of the internet becomes so big that it's so capacious it just figures out a way to scan all our brains, and then we live forever within it. Now, if this sounds goofy, it is really, really goofy. But it's also incredibly influential in the technical world. You see books about the singularity and related ideas all the time in computer science departments. I would say singularity books in computer science departments or in engineering departments in big companies are at least as common as rapture books are in a Bible bookstore or something like that. They're everywhere. There's a whole university that teaches this theology called the Singularity University that's next door to Google in Silicon Valley, and you can go there and sign up for courses. It's expensive. It's totally booked. This is actually influential, even though it's really nutty. But that's how religions are. These really nutty things all of a sudden become influential when you least expect them to. It happens again and again in human affairs all the time throughout history.